Hello knitters, Barbara Benson here. I am an independent knitwear designer who also likes to make videos here on my YouTube channel, Watch Barbara Knit. Make sure to check in the description notes below the video where you will find links to all of my online shenanigans, including how to get my patterns to knit up for yourself, how to join the Watch Barbara Knit Facebook group, how to support me on Patreon, and where to buy my merch. To kick the year off, I have a question that was put in one of the comments of another video, and while I'm going to answer the question that that was in the comments, it kind of sent the pinball machine in my brain off, and it pinged around a little bit and into like a whole subject area that is something I realized I hadn't spoken about and that y'all might find useful. Now, the question is here. So this individual was like, this is off topic to your video, but I have a knitting question that I have not found an answer to anywhere. How does slip stitching affect or not affect the length of your project? Normally you knit a stitch and it drops that previous stitch down, but when you slip a stitch, you're not doing that. You're not adding any length to that row. What? I don't understand how that doesn't ruin everything. Hope that makes sense. And it makes total sense, and it is absolutely a fantastic thing to be thinking about this because it has wide-reaching repercussions, not just for slip stitch, but all different types of textures that you can create with knitting, and that's where my brain went. So what we're going to be talking about is how the actual stitch patterns affect your knitting and how that might be something you need to think about, especially if you're trying to substitute stitches and different stitch textures and different stitch patterns into patterns that you might already own, or like if you have something that calls for a plain stockinette and you want to put something else into it. So I'm going to make this picture go away. Okay, so first we're going to address the actual slip stitch question. Now, I think that for most people, the number one time they're going to run into slip stitches used as slip stitches. And when I'm saying that, I mean as in it's just a slip stitch as opposed to a part of another stitch, like slip one, knit two together, pass, slip stitch over, or slip, slip, knit. Those are slip stitches, but they're constituent components of another stitch. That's not what we're talking about. We're just talking about slip stitches as a standalone stitch. Slip stitches as a standalone stitch is simply when you reach the stitch that needs to be slipped and you transfer it from the left-hand needle to the right-hand needle, assuming you're knitting, not mirror knitting, without working it in any way, without actually pulling yarn through it and adding a new stitch. You're just slipping that existing stitch over. Just FYI, the default is that you're going to slip it purlwise. I will put a link in the description notes below to a more elaborate conversation about this. But the default is slipping it purlwise unless you're specifically told to slip it knitwise. Because when you slip it knitwise, it reorients your stitch. And then if you just work it as usual on the next round, you're going to have a twisted stitch. So default is slipping purlwise. The number one place that people are going to run into slip stitches is in a slipped stitch edging, a selvage treatment that has slip stitches. And again, those could be slip knitwise or purlwise. It's one of those times where they might actually tell you to slip it knitwise, and also it can be slipped with yarn in front or yarn in back. Again, the default for slipping a stitch is slipping with the yarn held to the back of the work, which means on the right, if you're knitting flat, on the right side, it would be with the slipped with the yarn behind the stitch. And if you're knitting the wrong side, it would be slipped with the yarn held in front of the stitch because you are looking at the wrong side. You do not want that little bar to show on the front. Again, unless instructed otherwise, because sometimes you're deliberately slipping with that bar visible for textural or decorative effects. So in a slipped stitch edging, you are only slipping a stitch over one row. Okay, you're not slipping it over 2 rows, you're only slipping it. It's usually either the beginning or the end of the row. I will link to another video where I did a very in-depth figuring out the different ways you could do a slip stitch edge. It was one of my mad scientist types of experimental things. And the very simple answer is yarn is stretchy. I mean, that's my answer for you. Yarn is very stretchy. If you're only slipping that stitch over 1 row and you're only asking it to like extend 1 row above where it would normally be, when you block it, or even if you don't block it, yarn is stretchy. Yarn is not, that's not really going to have a significant impact on your length of your project, because especially with a slip stitch edge, you're slipping 1 stitch usually per row at either the begin or the end of the row. It's not, and then the next row you're going to knit that stitch. So you're only asking it to do a little bit of extra work. So it's not gonna get all bound up. Now I grabbed a couple of samples to show y'all, and I have this new setup, so hopefully it will work. So this is a good scarf, and it has slip stitches as a decorative effect, but it also has slip stitches. It has a slip stitch edge on it. So if you look here, you see how those slip stitches are long, and you can see how that 1 stitch goes over 2 rows. Now this is garter. So garter is compacted in the first place. So it's really, you're not asking, oops, why are you blurring? There we go. This is a new setup, so my apologies for extra. So you're only asking that stitch to just do a little bit of extra stretch. And especially when it's blocked, it's really not going to have a lot of impact. And because garter is compacting, which is something else we'll talk about, it's not a very big deal. And in specifically this design, these slip stitches are only slipped over 1 row, because on the next row you're going to purl these stitches. So again, we're only elongating it over 1 row, and especially here we're elongating it but only over garter. So we're not asking it to do a bunch of extra work. So will it compact it vertically? Tiny bit. And because it's only this amount, it's only a tiny bit because there's space in between these. Now, if this was slip 1, knit 1, slip 1, knit 1, slip 1, knit 1, like all the way across, that is going to have a lot more impact. But because there's this other space, there's plenty of yarn to be moved around during blocking. And if you want to see the other side of a good scarf, you can see it has the slip stitches on the other side as well. And it just, that's how a good scarf looks. And if I take this and pull it apart, you can actually see the columns that are the slip stitches from the previous row. You can see them right there. You can see that those are the little slipped bars that go behind. But because it's garter, this is like kind of magic. It pulls itself in, and it more functions almost like a ribbing, which is going to have the effect, because length isn't the only thing we need to worry about. Width. Slipping stitches also affects width because of this very reason, because you are stretching that yarn across and it kind of creates almost a ribbed effect. So that is just plain old slip stitch work. And there are all kinds of fun slip stitch patterns. What you just basically have to think about is the more the stitches are slipped, like the more quantity, like the percentage of stitches in like this much space, the more there are slipped, the more impact it is going to have on both the length and the width. So I'm going to put him aside. Now, color work. Slip stitches color work is where I typically do most of my work, and I grabbed these are my Spigato Mitts, because I wanted to show you specifically this tendency to pull in used like for a functional effect. So this is slip stitch, but it is not really mosaic because we are only knitting single round. It's stripes, but it's round stripes. Here, you can see it on the thumb really well. it's just single round. So we're not, again, we are only slipping stitches over one row, so we're not asking a whole lot extra out of those. But, so this is the herringbone pattern. Spigato, by the way, is an Italian term for herringbone, because when I went to look up how many things were named herringbone already in the Ravelry database, it was a lot. So right here, you can see I did a section where it's knit one, slip one, knit one, slip one, knit one, slip one, and then on the next round, it will be slip one, knit one, slip one, knit one, slip one. But we are slipping every other stitch over a series of rounds. Okay? Now, that is not going to affect the length particularly much. I mean, it is going to be a little bit, but I'm going to show you when I put it on, and I can feel it when I do this. I don't know how well you're going to be able to see it, but when I put it on, it is tight right here. Okay? And I think you can see it because this is the same circumference, and you can see how wide it is across my palm, right? But then how close to my wrist it is. And that was done deliberately in the design. I chose to do this because I could have just kept this herringbone pattern going all the way up through here. But what I did is I made this wrist of slip one, knit one, because I knew that the slipped stitches would compact horizontally across the wrist, and it makes it a tighter fitting piece. If you look, and you can see how it flares back out, and then we have our ribbing that is going to keep it flat and on my wrist. But this is using that slipped stitch nature to make sure that it's going to stay in. So it's the fact that slip stitches causes things to compact in both directions can be used to your benefit. So I'm going to do that. And then the third slip stitch example I have, because both of those were slipped over only one row. This is my Confundo shawl, you can see here, and this is traditional Mosaic. Okay? And so a couple of things. I know that this Mosaic is going to cause the fabric to tighten a little bit in both the length and the width of the fabric. So one way I worked around that was that this is a DK weight shawl, but it's worked on a size 9 needle, which is big for DK weight, but it's to put that extra looseness into the fabric to combat that tendency of it to get dense. But if you look at this, this is also one of those, what I talked about is the number or the intensity of the slip stitches is going to determine whether or not you're going to have major compaction. Because if you look at this carefully, you've got this long, you're knitting in the green and you have this long stretch of green, and then you just have slip one, knit one, slip one. And then a long stretch of green, and then slip one, knit one, slip one. So these slip stitches are not happening with any huge frequency. And then if we look at our orange row, we're doing our orange along, and then it's like this stretch of orange right here, and then one green stitch, and then a stretch of orange, and then one green stitch. So it's because this was a shawl and because I wanted it to drape, I used the slip stitches very, very sparingly, just enough to give a cool effect without causing it to get dense, because I wanted to keep it a nice drapey shawl. So again, if you're looking at a Mosaic pattern and it has a lot of slip stitches, and another big thing, and I didn't really have an example to show you because I don't particularly use it because I like floppy stuff, is if you have like if this was instead of slip, knit, slip, if this was, I just wanted a solid orange box and I was actually slipping 3 orange stitches side by side. So it would have been like knit 18, slip 3, knit 18, slip 3. This slipping 3 is going to really cause it to pull in, and especially slipping 3 repeatedly across a row is going to cause compactions in your work. So again, it's how many stitches are being slipped and how, like, just overall looking at the field of fabric, and then also how many stitches are being slipped in a consecutive row. The more it's going to have effect on your work. Now, even distribution is also an element, but it's just it gets very, you know, there's only so much you have to worry about. If you're not designing, you don't have to worry about this much. You just need to take a look at it, and you can know just by looking at it from what I've said, and you could just say, oh, does that have a lot, or is that more simple? If it's more simple, it's not going to compact as much. If it looks really, really busy, it might compact a good bit. So yes, it does have an effect, but not, hopefully the designer has taken that into consideration. Now, I'm going to flip back to talking to you full screen for a second, and then I have a few more pieces to show you after I pick things up off the ground. I dropped stuff. So the thing that I'm like, okay, so I've now answered, hopefully, the question that Tina's Book and Craft Corner asked a couple months ago, who they probably don't even watch the show anymore, but the question do that. And so specifically addressed the issue of slip stitches and how slip stitches, yes, definitely can affect both the length and the width of your knitting work. So you can't just willy-nilly substitute a mosaic pattern into like something designed for stockinette. It is going to have impact. It is going to change the size, which brings us to the word that none of y'all like, but if you've watched this at all, you knew it was coming, swatching. Swatching, and especially gauge swatching, because what you might be able to do if you wanted to substitute mosaic into a stockinette, what you're going to need to do is look at the gauge for the stockinette and then swatch your potential mosaic and adjust your needle size until your mosaic is close in gauge to the stockinette, if you can get it there. It is possible you can't get it there, but you might be able to. So that is what you have to do. The pinball effect was thinking about that. I don't know that a lot of people think about other fabric. I mean, it makes like slip stitches, it's like, oh, you're not knitting something. That is definitely going to affect. That is a very kind of obvious thing to look at. But different types of fabrics, different techniques also have very different properties and will run into these same challenges because they are different than standard stockinette or garter, and even stockinette and garter are different. So that is the additional stuff I wanted to talk about. Now we're going to go back to this and my thing. Now, these are just samples that I had for a different class. So I don't have a whole lot of examples, but I know people like visuals, so I'm going to do my best. So this is just stockinette. This is a stockinette swatch. These swatches are for my blocking class. So they are the same yarn, the same needle size, and the same cast on, just different techniques. So this stockinette, okay? This has been blocked fairly assertively, but even here you can see how the garter edge is kind of tapering. If there was more garter, it would want to taper even more, because stockinette is taller than it is wide, and garter is wider than it is tall, because the knit stitch is tall and skinny, and the purl stitch is shorter and fatter. So if you had the same number of rows, same number of stitches, same yarn and everything, and you knit, if I had a piece of garter here, like this exact same square, but in garter, the garter square would probably be about this tall, but it'd be like another ½ inch width. It would be shorter and wider because that is just what garter does. Garter compacts vertically and spreads horizontally. Stockinette spreads vertically and pulls in the horizontal axis. Now, if you have something like seed stitch or moss stitch or something that is a relatively equal number of knits and purls, you're going to get something in between. It's going to be more square because you're mixing those two things in. So that is stockinette. Now, I want to show you lace. This is the same number of stitches wide, and I believe very close to the same number of stitches tall. And I'm going to show you how, there we go. Now I blocked this, obviously lace could go either way. I blocked this lace for length because it pulled it out and I like the way it looked. If you look at this panel of stockinette, you can see that this is the same, almost the same width, but the lace is distinctly taller. Here, I can, let me see. Ooh, the lace is too tall. So you can see that lace expands. You can kind of pick which direction it expands on, but the same number of stitches and the same number of rows, if it's lace, is going to give you a bigger piece of fabric if you block it to highlight the lace. So again, if you are trying to substitute like if you want to try to work lace into a stockinette design, like if let's just assume all this we're talking about like a stockinette sweater. So it still has to fit. You can't just say, oh, I'm going to insert this lace panel and expect the garment to still fit. It's not going to, because that lace panel is going to make the overall width or length or both of the design expand. Okay? Now, the other common thing I'm going to show you, again, same number of stitches, same number of rows. Cables. Cables contract. Cables pull your fabric in. And if you look here, you can see that I've got the same stockinette going on where the stockinette is blocked. It's the same. And these were blocked many, many moons ago. So, I mean, they're not exact. And I think I did, for some reason, I think I did a seed stitch edge on this. Who knows? But you can definitely see that your edges on the stockinette panel, the cables have pulled them in. So again, if you have this stockinette sweater that you decide to just add some cables in, it is going to make it very specifically smaller width wise, assuming the cables are running vertically, because it's going to pull it in. Now, this can be used just like in the Spigato Mitts. This can be used deliberately. If you decided that you wanted to put some cables like up the waist type area, like kind of up the sides, you could create shaping with those cables. It would pull things in. So that can definitely be done. But again, it's just you need to know, and unfortunately you need to swatch. So cables are like that. So sum up. To sum up, stockinette is taller than it is wide. Garter is wider than it is tall. If you have a texture pattern that is a relatively equal number of knits and purls, then it's going to be more square. Well, more square, but in between, because garter is almost like perfectly square. But it's definitely squatter and wider. If you have cables are going to contract your work, and lace is going to loosen or expand your work. Now, I've seen people do some really fun stuff where it's like, okay, we're taking our same imaginary stockinette sweater. Well, maybe you add a panel of cables, but then put some lace on either side of the cables so they can cancel each other out and get you back to square one as far as fit goes. But the whole point of this video was to say yay to the commenter about thinking about the fact that changing slip stitches and how you put slip stitches into thing might change the gauge of your work, but also wanting to push people and maybe get you thinking about how different fabrics have different not components, different characteristics. You can't just substitute them willy-nilly. I encourage you to substitute. I encourage you to be creative and to be dangerous with your knitting, but do it smart. Do it in a really smart way. This made me think of when I was young is one of my father's favorite movies. I don't know if any of y'all have ever seen Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. In the opening sequence, they are robbing a train, and Butch has put they decide to blow up the safe to get into it. Like, they wanted to blow it open, and so they get on the train, and Butch, the smart one, puts the explosives on it, and then they get out of the train, and they're hunkering down and just waiting for it to explode, and it explodes, and it blows the entire train car up, and the money's coming down like snow. And he just looks at him, and he goes, "Think you used enough dynamite there, Butch?" And that's what I say. I want you to live dangerously with your knitting, but I don't want you to blow it up. Okay? There's a line between playing it fast and loose and having fun with your knitting and exploding. So don't overkill. Don't use too much dynamite, but use some of those, those little snap things that you throw on the ground during New Year's and stuff, a snap bang, use a little bit of sense. I mean, I'm not saying you got to use a lot of sense, because I don't use a lot of sense, but use a little bit of sense. So I really appreciate when people ask me questions like this that help me come up with subjects that I can talk about that can maybe help other knitters. So if you have any comments or thoughts or questions, please do not hesitate to comment on this or other videos. And if you like this video, please give it the thumbs up, click that like button, and you can click for subscribe and for notifications so that you will get a notification whenever I upload a new video. Thank you so much.